Hello everybody, this is Laurence Lesser here. We're about to start the 40th season of First Monday Concerts in Jordan Hall. They began when I was president of NEC. The year was 1985. And I created a series with a lot of help from a lot of wonderful people of 6 concerts a year, memorably a first Monday of certain calendar months. It's settled into October, November, December, March, April, May. So here we are getting ready for the opening concert of October 7, 2024. I'm going to stop for a second and tell you a little bit about my current circumstance. This August, all of a sudden, I was hit by a terrible medical event. I had great pains going up and down my legs, and I was taken by an ambulance to the hospital, where after a period of time I was diagnosed as having a spinal incident in the base of my spine. It took a little while to sort out what was the right thing to do, but actually on August 20th I had a spinal surgery to correct the problem. The very good news is that it did correct the problem. The unsettled news is that I'm having to learn how to walk all over again. With that as a background, I want to really just get down to it and tell you about this great program we have for tonight. And I'm going to glance once in a while over to my notes over here because I have a few things to quote that I think you will find interesting. In the years that we started in 1985, virtually everything was what we would call classical chamber music, string quartets, piano trios, anything like that, and always with a diverse nature and a diverse cast of characters performing. So that over these 40 years, I am betting that there have been 350 or 400 different artists playing and giving their best for this very discriminating audience. I can also tell you that for all of that time, not one artist has been paid for doing these concerts. The idea of the concerts is it's a joyful encounter among colleagues for a great audience, which is what you are, and we do it in one of the greatest concert halls in the whole world, and we celebrate all of those things. So let me tell you what we're up to in this season. Very often I find themes for a season. One thing that can tie things together very well is to celebrate anniversaries, birth or death, of famous composers and artists. This season is no exception. Looking forward to the entire season, there's going to be a lot of it. And we have some of that in this first program. But I want to start at the beginning. I was thinking about how do we celebrate a 40th anniversary of doing something so joyful? I guess the answer is you play a Bach Brandenburg concerto. And I want to tell you about those pieces because we take them now for granted. But actually, they were all written before Bach moved to Leipzig for his most famous and long-enduring employment. But he was always, wherever he was looking for a better circumstance for himself. And he had visited once a man with the title of royalty of the Margrave. I don't know quite what that means, but that's what he was called, the Margrave of Brandenburg. And he assembled 6 concertos, concerto grosso you might call them, each one with different instrumentation and different combinations. And I want to read to you a portion of what he sent along with the manuscript that he had copied out himself, that he sent by an emissary to the Margrave. As I had the good fortune a few years ago to be heard by Your Royal Highness at Your Highness's commands, and as I noticed then that your Highness took some pleasure in the little talents which heaven has given me for music, and so begging your Highnesses most humbly not to judge their imperfection with the rigor of that discriminating and sensitive taste which everyone knows him to have for musical works, that is, the Margrave, but rather to take into benign consideration the profound respect and the most humble obedience which I thus attempt to show him. If it sounds to me like somebody wants a new job, that's right. That's what he was looking for. And the one we're going to play tonight, the one in D major number 2, is joyful because the dominant instrument in the first and last movements is called the piccolo trumpet or the Baroque trumpet. It's a small version of the trumpet with no valves and a very high pitch. And it's joyful, it's just like bells ringing. And so the first and last movements have that characteristic. But in the middle of that, Bach writes a movement without the trumpet. I mean, I think partly out of consideration for the trumpet, for this is a very hard part for him to rest his lips, but also because typically the trumpet without valves on it played only certain notes, and if he wanted the composer wanted to go into a different key, there was no way to do it. So instead he wrote a very sublime, very beautiful movement featuring the oboe, violin solo, recorder, flute, and continuo, that is cello and harpsichord. So that's how we're starting our program, and that's how we're starting the 40th season. And by the way, the thing you may not know is that after Bach sent that manuscript to him, the pieces lay on a shelf in the library of the Margrave of Brandenburg until they were rediscovered decades later. Now when we think about the Brandenburg concertos, they're among the most popular pieces of Bach, and the holiday season never goes past without organizations all over the world doing all 6 of them on maybe 2 programs. We're just doing the one this year to remind everybody what a wonderful thing it is that we're still here to start our 40th season. The second piece on our program by the very well-known American composer Samuel Barber is an unusual piece. Barber grew up in the Philadelphia area, and he went to the Curtis School of Music. He was born in 1910. Okay, and that was in the early years of the Curtis Institute, and he had 3 majors there. He was a wonderful singer, a baritone, he played the piano, and he was a composer. Now, what is a really interesting information relative to our school, New England Conservatory, is that his aunt was a mezzo-soprano named Louise Homer. Louise Homer was a student of New England Conservatory. And if you're ever wandering around the school near Brown Hall, between the 2 doors that you can enter the hall from is a plaque on the wall listing some famous alumni. And there engraved on the plaque is the name Louise Homer. So we're part of the legacy of Samuel Barber. So Barber wrote music that I would say was, some people thought he was very old-fashioned. He was not dissonant like Schoenberg, whose music we are celebrating next month, by the way, or Bartók, or some of the modernists, Paul Hindemith. He was what people thought was an old-fashioned kind of composer. He didn't mind being called that. He said, you can like what you want to like, but I'm writing the music that feels right for me. And that really characterized a lot of his music. When he was at Curtis studying composition, he met another young man named Giancarlo Menotti. Giancarlo Menotti was an opera composer whose operas actually appeared on Broadway. It was kind of funny in a way that he was doing what he wanted to do and not what everybody said was the most avant-garde. And it happens the two of them were a couple for more than 40 years. And later on, when Barber wrote operas, there were two important operas he wrote, one called Vanessa and one called Antony and Cleopatra, the latter of which was written for the opening of the Metropolitan Opera in Lincoln Center. Very, very big thing. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but I would say that the piece that most people think about with Samuel Barber is called Adagio for Strings. It's actually an arrangement for string orchestra of the slow movement of a string quartet he wrote. And it is something that is so well ingrained in musical history, usually played on sad, solemn occasions. It was played at a memorial for John F. Kennedy after his assassination. It was played after 9/11 in New York. It was played all over the world because it captures somehow a very, very deep feeling and a very American feeling about sadness. To go on, I mean, he wrote a lot of wonderful music. He wrote a wonderful violin concerto, he wrote a piano concerto, cello concerto, and those operas, and a lot of pieces for orchestra and songs. What happened really was when Antony and Cleopatra was premiered at the opening of the new Metropolitan Opera in New York City in the Lincoln Center, it was immediately attacked by critics as a terrible piece. This is, can you imagine, you've spent 2 or 3 years writing a piece for one of the iconic moments in history of classical music, not only in New York City, but everywhere. The Metropolitan Opera moves uptown to a brand new hall. The star of it, playing Cleopatra, was the great Black American singer Leontine Price, and wonderful, wonderful artist. But the piece failed. And not long after that, his relationship with Menotti failed. And as he got older, he got very often depressed, drank too much. He was not in good shape. Toward the end of his life, he wrote a song cycle that we're going to hear tonight that is called Despite and Still. It's rather remorseful, and it's for piano and singer. It was written for Leontine Price, who was a very, very great artist, soprano. And we're going to have a performance of it to conclude the first half of the program tonight. It has poetry written by James Joyce of Ulysses fame, of other poets, British and American. And the piece, for the first time really in his life, conveys a certain sense of bitterness and anxiety and remorse. And it's a very, very powerful piece. The cycle of those few songs only lasts about 13 or 14 minutes. And that plus the Brandenburg Concerto, which is not very long itself, makes for a rather short first half of our program. But after the intermission, we have more to give you, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I told you in my introductory remarks that it's become a common occurrence in my building programs for a season to recognize anniversaries. They're not always births, they're sometimes deaths. In this case, it's the latter. The greatest transitional composer in France of the late 19th century was named Gabriel Fauré. Gabriel Fauré he had a very interesting career path, and I'm going to tell you some of it. I mean, the whole story is really a long one. He was born in the south of France in a very beautiful place, from a family that cared about culture, but not particularly about music. And before he turned 9, he found there was a church in the small town where he grew up that had a harmonium, which is kind of like an organ with your foot pedals. And he used to go in there not knowing what he was doing, but he would sit down at that instrument and play away whatever he felt like doing. It happened that a blind relative of the family was there and heard him play. He was not yet 9 years old, and implored Fauré's parents to give him a musical education because she was very convinced that he had a very deep musical impulse. They thought about it for a while, and then when he was 9 years old, he was sent off to a special school in Paris which emphasized preparing young keyboard players for a life in church music. You can guess that's in a time when there were churches everywhere and they all had organs. And for those years that continued for about 8 or 9, he mastered all kinds of things about music. He became a really fine organ player. He mastered all kinds of theory and everything related with the art and science of writing music, of how to put down what you hear and how to make it work. Around that time, he met possibly, at that moment, the most famous composer in France, Camille Saint-Saëns, who became the piano teacher at that school. And it formed a friendship that lasted more than 60 years until Saint-Saëns died at a very elevated age. We all know Saint-Saëns for having written, for whatever reason, whether you like it or not, The Carnival of the Animals, which was a party piece that he wrote. But Saint-Saëns was a very serious musician, and he also wanted to bring these young people along in a very, very special way. That's, by the way, very close to how all of us at the Conservatory feel about the exceptionally talented people we have the privilege of teaching here. He got famous jobs in Paris playing the organ, so that he rose to some of the loftiest positions of that. And what is ironic is that I think he was a great organ player, but he never wrote a single piece for it. And I think what people say is that he much preferred the piano because he felt there was more subtlety you could achieve in that. He eventually, there's a lot of politics involved in this. There was, around the Paris Conservatory, an old guard who didn't want to go anything toward modernism, and then there were some younger people who did. And if I tell you that in those period of years, Fauré got very interested in traveling, and he went with friends many times to Bayreuth, where Richard Wagner was presenting his own written operas in his own opera house. And he traveled all over the place, and he was always very interested in what was new. Well, he settled into a style that was a mixture of old and new. It was very tonal, but he also got very subtle in how he moved from key to key in the music he was writing, and creating in that some very, very intoxicating musical feelings. We're going to sense that in the music we're listening to tonight. But I'll say that eventually he became a piano teacher at the Paris Conservatory, much against the old guard who thought that he was so modern that, there was no, what was it going to come to? It was just terrible stuff. And I would say he was very, very interested as a teacher to not tell the students how they should be, but to help them understand what was possible and give them the means to do it. It's quite possible that the most famous composer who studied with him was Maurice Ravel. Fauré was a dedicated teacher. He was very active in the politics of new music, societies of composers and all kinds of things like that. And he was so much admired that in 1922, 2 years before his death, which we're celebrating in 1924, he was given prizes by the President of France. There was a huge celebration of him. And this was a very tough time for him because gradually, with age, he began to lose his sense of hearing. And yet he continued writing, and he wrote in a style that is incredibly complex. I mean, he was really the bridge to the 20th century strong musical presence in France. Well, that's enough about him. I mean, let's get down to what we're going to listen to. We're inviting the singers back who sang the Barber in the first half to do two of the most famous songs that Fauré wrote, called one Après un rêve, After a Dream, and Au clair de la lune, in the beautiful reflection of the clear full moon. And those songs are really in the most popular period of his life. He, by the way, wrote well over 100 songs. He was very famous for that. Also, many wonderful pieces for solo piano, 2 piano quartets, and later on, piano quintets, 2 cello sonatas, and at the very end of his life, he struggled, in spite of his hearing deficiency, to write a string quartet, which he barely finished before he died. So what we have here is an example of somebody who represents an epoch in our musical lives that is transitional from a very, very conservative attitude of old-fashioned romanticism to a whole new world of sound. So that's our program for tonight, ending with the Fauré Piano Quartet in C minor, a very famous piece, and it deserves every bit of attention we all give to it. Thank you very much.